Quasi contracts. A quasi-contract is not a real contract because it is not formed by agreement between the parties. It is a contract created by law to prevent unjust enrichment of one person at the cost of another. Even though there is no offer, acceptance, or consent, the law imposes an obligation as if a contract existed. Quasi-contracts are based on the principle of equity, justice, and good conscience. The provisions relating to quasi-contracts are contained in sections 68 to 72 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872. Meaning of quasi-contract. A quasi-contract is an obligation imposed by law where one person is required to compensate another, even in the absence of a valid contract. The liability arises not because of any promise, but because it would be unfair to allow one party to enjoy benefits without paying for them. Nature of quasi-contracts. The nature of quasi-contracts is different from ordinary contracts because they are not based on agreement or consent of the parties. A quasi-contract is created by operation of law to prevent one person from being unjustly enriched at the expense of another. Even though there is no offer, acceptance, or mutual consent, the law imposes an obligation as if a contract exists. The main purpose of quasi-contracts is to ensure fairness, justice, and equity. They are enforceable in the same manner as ordinary contracts, and the remedies available are also similar. Thus, the nature of quasi-contracts lies in their legal obligation imposed by law rather than by the will of the parties. No agreement between the parties. One of the main features of a quasi-contract is that there is no agreement between the parties. Unlike ordinary contracts, quasi-contracts do not arise from offer, acceptance, or mutual consent. The parties may not even know each other. The obligation is imposed by law to prevent one party from getting an unfair benefit at the cost of another. Therefore, even in the absence of any agreement, the law treats the situation as if a contract exists in order to ensure justice and fairness. Obligation is imposed by law. In a quasi-contract, the obligation does not arise from the consent or promise of the parties, but is imposed by law. The law creates this obligation to prevent one person from being unjustly enriched at the expense of another. Even though the parties have not entered into any contract, the law treats the situation as if a contractual relationship exists. Thus, the duty to compensate arises automatically due to legal provisions and not because of any agreement between the parties. Based on the principle of unjust enrichment, quasi-contracts are based on the principle of unjust enrichment, which means that no person should be allowed to gain unfairly at the expense of another. When one person receives a benefit without any legal justification, the law requires him to compensate the person who provided that benefit. This principle ensures fairness and equity, even in the absence of an agreement. Therefore, quasi-contracts exist to prevent unjust enrichment and to restore balance between the parties. Enforceable like a contract. Although a quasi-contract is not a real contract, it is enforceable like a contract. The law allows the aggrieved party to approach the court and claim compensation in the same manner as in an ordinary contract. The remedies available in quasi-contracts are similar to those in contractual obligations. Thus, even without an agreement, a quasi-contract creates a legal relationship that can be enforced by law to ensure justice and prevent unjust enrichment. Remedies are same as those of a contract. In quasi-contracts, the remedies available are the same as those in ordinary contracts. The aggrieved party can claim compensation or reimbursement through legal action just like in a contractual dispute. Although there is no agreement between the parties, the law provides similar remedies to enforce the obligation imposed. This ensures that the person who has suffered loss due to the act of another gets proper relief. Thus, quasi-contracts offer remedies similar to contracts to maintain fairness and justice.